Thank you so much, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jonathan Lincoln. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization. Great to see you all. This is our second event of the semester, and we're very pleased to welcome Yaakov Katz. Yaakov Katz is the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Has been a frequent contributor to the very robust dialogue on Israel, on Israel's security situation, on politics, on the relationship with the Palestinians, and in true form, he has just finished really an incredibly important. It's not really uplifting reading, I don't think, but it's an incredibly important contribution. His latest book. While Israel slept, how Hamas surprised the most powerful military in the Middle East, together with his colleague Amir Bahbat. And the book is an incredibly rich overview, and I think I'll let Yaakov talk about it, but of what you called, Yaakov, the systemic failure, really. And I think it's you're not soft necessarily on Netanyahu, but you've avoided some of the, I think, overt polemics in some ways in trying to focus the failure necessarily on one individual, one man. And of course, that makes sense, and it's only really someone with your knowledge and your research capacity and because of your position that can really explain that the failure wasn't about what did or didn't happen, solely what did or didn't happen on October 6th, but of course stems years back, and you give a historical overview, a political overview of how Israel has dealt with Hamas. And it's absolutely vital reading, I think, for anyone who wants to understand this failure and really understand what's happening today. So before I hand it over to you to let us say, I think that we're very much living through an ongoing situation. I don't know. I was talking about this with some colleagues actually this morning, and I was wondering whether you had hoped, perhaps, that this would be history, right? But it's very much an ongoing situation. Unfortunately, but when you were writing this, but now it's very much an ongoing situation. We just saw, of course, Israel's strike on Hamas in Doha, in Qatar, which, at least from my perspective, I think probably from a lot of people's perspective, takes this situation to a new level. Maybe the full implications will come out in due time. But as we're very much dealing with an ongoing situation, maybe with that in mind, thinking about the situation literally today and the ongoing war, I'd be grateful if we could start by understanding a little bit about your approach to this issue, and maybe you could talk also from a personal angle, just as an Israeli, and about how important it is right now to sort of begin. And I think it's really the beginning of this examination of this failure. So, Yaakov, welcome. Thank you.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you all for coming. I see Chuck Freilich is here, an old friend, someone who I've often spoke to over the years about issues like this, Israel's national security. A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, sorry.
But no, all good. The story of the book is actually, and maybe through that I can kind of answer some of the questions. Amir and I, this is now my fourth book, but Amir and I wrote a book that came out in 2017 called Weapon Wizards, which looked at how Israel had developed some of the most sophisticated military technology. And then in between, I wrote a book about the bombing of Syria's nuclear reactor back in 2007. And then when I stepped out as editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post back in mid-2023, which happens to a lot of editors, we get burned out. That's what happens. But I wanted to write a new book. And we had this idea. I said to Amir, let's do a sequel to Weapon Wizards that kind of looks at how Israel had created what we thought was a very unique strike capability that merged and synergized between intelligence, tactics, technology, and a way of fighting, an Israeli way of fighting. And we thought that could make for an interesting story, and how it was being employed in Gaza and being employed in Lebanon, and what Israel was calling the campaign between campaigns, or the war between wars in Syria, with countless bombings, but never anything escalating above a very, very low threshold. And we signed a deal with our publisher, St. Martin's Press, and that was probably in June of 2023. And then, of course, 4 months later, we all know what happens on October 7th. And then that book was no longer really relevant. So we pivoted and spoke to St. Martin's Press and said, listen, there was obviously a failure that's obvious to everyone of how did this happen. But there's a much bigger story here that needs to be told. And then we spent about a year, alongside all our other responsibilities, and Amir is the daily military correspondent for a website called Walla News in Israel, and I now at a think tank, and also continuing to write columns and media appearances and other things, running a new conference. But all that together, we were deeply in the midst of the research, and interviewed probably hundreds of people in this for this book. And what we discovered was that obviously there was a massive failure, right, in the night between October 6th and October 7th, and we go into great detail. And I think what shocked me or surprised me was just how much was happening that night that we didn't know about. Now a lot more is known, and really in the book we try to kind of even time it out. At 3 a.m. there was this phone call. At 4 a.m. there was this phone call. At 4:30 a.m. this guy went to the Shin Bet, the Israeli security agency headquarters. At Friday afternoon, this and this was happening. I mean, there were all these things that were going on, a flurry of activity. Alarm bells were ringing in all of the different security headquarters in Israel, in the IDF, in military intelligence, in the Shin Bet headquarters. And I mean, just 3 quick examples. There was something with the SIM cards. You might have read at one point of how about 100 SIM cards Israeli SIM cards were suddenly inserted into Palestinian phones in Gaza, and Israel detected that there were 100 now Israeli lines that were live in Gaza, which would indicate one of two things. Either there's suddenly 100 Israelis in Gaza, or that there's some people who are planning to enter Israel where their Palestinian SIM cards wouldn't work, and therefore they'd want to have open lines of communication. So is that a sign of an invasion? They were uncovering underground rocket launchers. What was that about, if not to launch rockets? And they were preparing underground bunkers for the top commanders, like Mohammed Def, the elusive military commander, for him and his family to descend into. So, I'll borrow a phrase that Donald Rumsfeld famously said: while there was so much information, there was no imagination. It wasn't a lack of information, it was a lack of imagination. And I think that you had all this information, but why was it not digested correctly? Why was it not analyzed correctly? And of course, there were structural flaws. There was information that got stuck in the pipeline. There wasn't the right channels of communication between the Shin Bet and the IDF. And for example, in the immediate aftermath of the attack, there was all this reporting of how the chief of staff of the IDF spoke in the middle of the night on the phone with the head of the director of the Shin Bet. That's the agency that's whole task, single sole mission is combating basically Palestinian terrorism. They never spoke throughout the night, right? That was wrong. The first conversation they had was at 6:29 in the morning on Saturday when the attack commenced. And the Shin Bet director gets on the phone with the IDF chief of staff and says, listen, they're going to try to kidnap people. All right, it's going to happen. And obviously they end up abducting 251, 48 of whom remain in Hamas captivity in Gaza still today. So what we saw obviously was that and I don't want to, it's not a tactical failure, because of course it had such strategic and almost existential repercussions. But it was that moment. What happened? What led to that moment that all that information was looked at in that way? And for that, we need to really go back in time, I think, to the founding of Hamas and to the way that Israel approached and viewed this terrorist organization. And I want to say something about Israel in general. And this ties to your question about what is it like being an Israeli over the last 2 years. But, Israelis, I think, and maybe this doesn't always add up with what we consume in the media, but I'll just tell you my opinion, and someone who's lived there now for about 30 years. Israelis, first of all, they view themselves as part of the Western world, right? If you do a poll in Israel and you ask, are you Western or Eastern? We're part of the West. I mean, we consume, our trade is with the EU, our trade is with America. Yeah, we have some trade with the East. EU is our biggest trade partner. We consume American media. American film, American TV, our cultural ties are here. It's not with India or China, right? Those are some trade partners, but it's not a cultural relationship. It's not an ethical or value relationship like what we have here. We're a liberal democracy. So we view ourselves as being part of the liberal democratic world. And therefore, we kind of, and maybe the best way to say it is we think we're Luxembourg. But our problem is that our neighbors are not Belgium, France, and Germany, right? Our neighbors are Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime until recently in Syria, and Iran off on the horizon. So we want to believe that we can live a quiet and peaceful life, and we can't. And it's true that Israel is probably one of the most vigilant countries when it comes to military and the threat matrix that it does face. But when you want to live quietly and peacefully, then that's where a policy of containment comes from. And we tried to trace back and understand, when did this policy of containment, was it created? How was it incubated over time? And then when did it basically just take over everything? And I look at the policy of containment, I think what we discovered is that it had pretty much three legs to it. Hamas was always there and was always a problem since the 1980s. And, it's very easy today to go back in time and say we could have, we should have, we would have. And it's very easy for me to say that as well, someone who's been writing about this for the larger part of more than 20 years. And, went along with the story, never really asked the tough questions also. And I feel that kind of measure of responsibility as a reporter and then as an editor of a newspaper. I was at those briefings with the chief of staff and the head of military intelligence. And they would, we would hear Hamas say, we're coming to kill you. And we wouldn't say to the guys when they would say, oh, no, they're deterred. We would say, but they're saying this. And when you look back now, you see they said everything that they were going to do, right? But we said to them, no, you don't mean it. You actually want economic prosperity, right? You want us to help to allow Palestinian workers. You want money, all those different things. So we looked at, how did this policy of containment come to be created? And the policy, I think, has those three legs. Leg number one is technology, right? Israel, 20 years ago in the summer of 2005, pulls out of Gaza in the famous disengagement plan. And pretty quickly, it finds itself being pulled back in. 2006 in June, Gilad Shalit, a single soldier, is abducted. Operation Summer Rains commences in Gaza. 2008-9, Israel launches Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. 2014, Operation Protective Edge, which lasted 50 or 51 days. I mean, you get the point here. It just keeps on repeating itself. And Israel is trying, okay, how do we break this cycle? So, number one, what we had happen is after 2012, suddenly in 2013, Iron Dome goes operational, right? Suddenly we're able to swat missiles out of the sky like mosquitoes. So they fire missiles, but we're not compelled to respond because now it's no longer a real strategic threat. So we don't feel like we always have to retaliate. That gives us the ability to, what I call diplomatic maneuverability. We can decide what's for us, when it's right for us, when it's not right for us. Then in 2014, when they start popping out of tunnels, right, along the border, and they kill some soldiers, Israel gets pushed into Gaza again. Netanyahu was very hesitant, didn't want to launch a ground offensive. But people in the cabinet, including Naftali Bennett, say, you got to go in. They go in. They try to destroy some of the cross-border tunnels. They say, we got to solve the problem. What do? They dig the iron wall, right? They dig down to the aquifer. They put down a wall 50 meters or so. And then they build these sensors along the border. They put together the teams with the best and the brightest of seismic and sonar experts. They pull from the submarine fleets. And the geologists and construction guys, and they build a system still highly classified that can detect when a tunnel is being dug, locate it pretty much, and even tell you what tool's being used. Is it a jackhammer? Is it a shovel? Is it a bulldozer? Wow. How many people crossed into Israel on October 7th through a tunnel? 0. They all came above ground. So we created all this technology that gave us a sense of security, but it was false. That's pillar one. By the way, on technology is also intelligence. Yeah. Right? We were reliant on electronic intelligence, signal intelligence, without any human intelligence assets. Pillar two is the truth, which is we had bigger fish to fry. We have Iran. We have Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets and missiles. Hamas is there, but they're lower on the totem pole. We can't. And you think about what Israel has succeeded in doing to Hezbollah in Iran. I mean, look at the pager attack. Wow, right? Breathtaking. If we could do that, how come we couldn't do this? If we could take out all of Iran's military leadership, scientific leadership, penetrate with the help of the Americans, into their underground uranium enrichment processing facilities, how come we couldn't take care of this? So it shows that if you have resources, we have the resources, just the attention, the focus. And that's because of Pillar 2. And Pillar 3, maybe a little more controversial, is that I think politically for Netanyahu here, having Hamas in charge of Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in charge of the West Bank, not that he wanted, God forbid, October 7th to ever happen, but having this situation made the best argument for him to be able to make when he would go meet with Barack Obama or anyone else and explain why he can't move forward with the Palestinian state. And that is part of his core ideology, whether we like it or not, right? And we don't have to agree with him, but I'm just explaining the reality as I see it. He is against the establishment of a Palestinian state. He has always been against the establishment of a Palestinian state, and having the Palestinian people divided was seen as something of an asset as a diplomatic and political tool.
No, absolutely fascinating, really, really interesting analysis. And I think that just as in some ways, as a school of political science, in some ways, I mean, maybe just to extrapolate a little bit about what you said about the over-reliance on technology, it always struck me also as someone who studied in Israel, who worked in Israel for a little bit. I recall my first experience actually in the 90s, in 95, bus bombing campaigns by Hamas in when I was a student at Hebrew University. And I remember, there's a very Israeli approach in my mind. People were trying to bomb buses, so they put somebody in front of every bus and they checked everybody, and I was just thinking then, and this is where my academic career started to blossom in some ways, and of course this was, the Oslo heyday in some ways, but even then it was pretty clear it wasn't going to work. But where was the diplomacy? I mean, and you mentioned Netanyahu, but Netanyahu comes as a result, I think, of partly as a failure in some ways of peace process. The Second Intifada, the results, I should say, of disengagement in some ways. How much of that do you think is part of the story?
I mean, look, Netanyahu specifically, let's remember in 2009, Israel goes to a new election. Olmert was the prime minister. I think that Olmert wanted to try to topple Hamas to an extent. And Netanyahu, but his hands are tied at the end of we're already in an election. He has resigned as prime minister. The government has collapsed. And Netanyahu is running against Tzipi Livni, who's no longer in politics, but she was the head of the Kadima party, replaced Ehud Olmert at the time. And Netanyahu promises, and we're in the middle of Kasled in Gaza, 3-week operation, and Netanyahu promises, when I'm elected, I will topple Hamas. You can find these videos, he says it publicly. And it could be that he thought that he could, but I think he comes into office and he starts to begin to realize that there's a diplomatic or political opportunity here. That takes some time to realize itself, but I think that was something that happened early on. But I think that you're 100% that Israelis, because again of what I think is at the core, the foundation, what I spoke about before, like that Western mentality to an extent, it makes us put a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound to some extent. So we constantly are thinking to ourselves, we can solve this. We don't have to be drawn into a conflict. And listen, if you can kick the can down the road sometimes, that's a good thing, right? If you can avoid casualties, that's not a bad thing. Look at the 900 soldiers who have been killed in this war, the 1,200 people massacred on October 7th, the 251 hostages who were taken. And I don't believe for a second the number that the Hamas Health Ministry puts out, and that's what it is the Hamas Health Ministry, but we can't ignore that there are tens of thousands of people in Gaza who have been killed. So whether it's 60,000 or 55,000 or 50,000, it doesn't make a difference. Gaza has been devastated, and the people of Gaza are suffering tremendously, right? So there were good reasons why to avoid this war. Look at how Israel is now being viewed as a pariah state and is more isolated. Look what's about to happen at the United Nations. And I think next week or the week after, we have about a couple dozen countries that might be recognizing a Palestinian state, which I'm not sure what that state is and what this does for the chances to achieve peace one day. But this is something that Israel pretty much knew would happen. So to avoid that is also, it's not stupid. But I think the way we went around it is, I mean, if I told you here today that we're going to end this war now, and that the way we're going to keep things quiet and stable is we're going to ask our Qatari friends, well, they used to be our friends until Tuesday, we could talk about that, but we're going to ask Qatar to give $30 million of cash every month to Hamas in Gaza. You would all think that I'm crazy for even proposing such an idea. But we did that for 5 years, right? And, and to your point before of how Amir and I stayed away from politics, we did it for a reason. Because, I mean, there's 2 reasons why. Mm-hmm. Number one is we really believe that the blame and the fault rests with everyone.
Yes.
Everyone who has been here prime minister. And there haven't been that many. And Israel today is really Bibi's Israel. But Netanyahu was removed from office in the summer of 2021. You had Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid for 18 months as prime ministers. Lapid replaced Bennett towards the end. They implemented and adopted the same exact policies. I mean, Bennett, go back and look how much he took credit and praise. This is the quietest period. I'm letting in 10,000 Palestinian workers. I'm letting in 15,000 Palestinian workers. Bennett promised no suitcases of cash. And we tell the story that I find to be amusing, but it's just indicative of what happened. Where he comes into office, he had promised no suitcases of cash. His staff had come up with this amazing idea that we're going to do direct deposits in Palestinian bank accounts. And John, you know this because you've worked there, right? I mean, he's got this 2-star general military secretary, head of the National Security Council, a guy that Chuck knows well, who's at the table, his foreign policy advisor, and they're all talking about these direct deposits. And his young 25-year-old spokesman says, I don't know what you guys know, but I know as this young soldier, I did my service in the civil administration, which is the liaison office between military and the Palestinians. Muhammad, Mustafa, Yusuf, Ibrahim, they don't have bank accounts, right? So these poor, needy Palestinians in Gaza, who the money's supposed to go to, although it's going to Hamas, you can't make direct deposits to them. So they come up with this, do a whole new plan. They come up with this idea they're going to give the money to the UN. The UN's going to deposit in the Arab Bank, I think it was. The Arab Bank's going to print gift cards or debit cards, and they're going to give them out. But again, it's the same thing, right? You're taking $30 million, you're giving it to Hamas to distribute. So it's on gift cards as opposed to cash. So now they still have $30 million open to do other things with, terrorist things with. I mean, so this was everybody. And therefore, so we decided to stay away from that issue because, number one, everyone shares the blame. Number two, not very different than this country, but Israel today is highly, highly politicized in a toxic way. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have said to me, why did you need to write 330-something pages and 90,000 words? There's one word for the book, Bibi. Right. And I think that, trust me, I mean, if it was up to me, he would no longer be in office. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the man is in charge. He should be held accountable. We have a serious accountability issue. But we would lose. It would just all get lost. If I made it political, then we wouldn't be able to really talk about the main issues, which is how does a policy of containment get created? How does it filter through and trickle down through a military? How does an intelligence agency miss these signs, lack the imagination, not understand, and then the recommendations that we make? How do we institute structural reform where needed?
So just before, and I want to talk about the recommendations in a second, but there are one of the parts I found really interesting is there are some unlikely, I don't know if the word hero is the right word, but there are some people who come off looking better than others.
Yeah.
And it's an unlikely crowd, if you don't mind. Avigdor Lieberman, the General Brick, people like that. Maybe you could give us a sense. I mean, what was it about them necessarily that put the pieces together, or were they just actually maybe naively paying more attention to what you said was kind of in the open?
Well, I think Avigdor Lieberman. I don't know if everyone knows who he is. Just one word. Lieberman is a Moldovan-born politician, Moldovan-born Jew, immigrated to Israel, climbed up in the ranks, used to be very close to Netanyahu, broke off, like all these people who used to be close to Netanyahu eventually break off and establish their own political party. And in 2016, in May of 2016, he is appointed defense minister. Netanyahu was able to bring Lieberman's party into the coalition, appoints him as defense minister. And Lieberman, served in the military in his mid-20s as someone after he had moved to Israel, but was not a career officer, was not a general, did not come from that world. And he, after about 6 months in the job, writes an 11-page document, classified as very top secret, where he basically outlines one-to-one, literally one-to-one, back in 2016, what's going to happen with Hamas. And that if Hamas does not stop now, we will find ourselves in very near future where they will go from several thousand rockets to tens of thousands, where they will go from several thousand fighters to tens of thousands. They will go from a few miles of tunnels to hundreds of miles. He just spells it out, and it's what happened. And that document was completely ignored. There were other people within General Brick, who was a Yom Kippur War hero in 1973. I mean, he was kind of and kind of not. On the one hand, he was someone who was warning for a long time about strategic surprises and about the military not being ready. And he was 100% right. The military was not ready, and there was a strategic surprise. But I think where he was wrong was he was one of the people who was trying to press Netanyahu not to send the ground forces in because he did not have faith and trust in them.
Yes, sure.
And I think that the Israeli military and the ground forces have proven to be superior and extremely capable, despite the death toll and the casualties that they have sustained throughout this war. This is a terrible conflict. But you also had, and I think we opened the book telling the story about what are called the Tatzpitaniyot, right?
That's true.
The surveillance soldiers, those female spotters, women who are stationed and deployed along the border, and their job is to watch. And the joke always was, for years, and I've been in those bases so many times, but the joke always was is that they would, if a bee was flying along the border, they would see it or hear it. They knew everything about their zones of what they were watching, and they had been warning for months that things were changing, right? That Hamas was normalizing its presence in places that it shouldn't have been. That more senior commanders were being detected there. That things were happening, and their commander shut them down. And to me, it was that they are the best illustration of this systemic failure, because they had warned and had been shut down. One of the bases where they were, a small outpost called Nahal Oz, 15 of them were murdered by Hamas. 6 of them were taken hostage. There's a video that came out months after October 7th that shows the Hamas fighters gathering 5 of them against a wall. They're bloodied, they're beaten, their friends have just been murdered, their bodies are lying nearby, and the Hamas fighters start to prostrate themselves and praise Allah and pray. By the way, many Muslim, it has to be said, Muslim clerics around the world came out and said the way Hamas was praying at that moment is completely anti-Islam. But saying, I want to marry you, we want to get you pregnant, and they're begging for their lives. And they were, and we then know that at Nahal Oz, Hamas had about an hour and a half. And when they left, this was before the IDF even got there. So they were abandoned on October 7th. 6 of them taken to Gaza, 1 of them rescued about a month later. 5 of them held in Gaza until January of this year. So spent about 500 days in the Gaza Strip. They were abandoned then, they were abandoned now. Thankfully, they're home now. But that is the epitome, I think, to a great extent, of just how there were people warning, and we being the top leadership was not willing to listen.
So quickly, maybe on the recommendations, and just to say, after this, we'd like to go to the audience for questions. So please think about what you might want to ask. But before we do that, I'd like to talk about the recommendations. And again, maybe, a part of this discussion about, Bibi's culpability and everything. I think one of the things that is not really so discussed in your book, but that is really hard, I think, for at least I'll speak for myself, but I think a lot of us watching the situation, specifically from the societal perspective in Israel, is the controversy over the national inquiry, or a committee of inquiry, I guess is how it would be phrased. I think one of the obvious explanations is, of course, Bibi doesn't want it because he would be culpable, and it's hard for him to leave. But just in terms of the impact on Israeli society as well, and then also for your recommendations, which touch on this but don't really go specifically into that. So while you're talking about the recommendations, maybe if you could touch on this issue of the committee.
There is no question in my mind that we desperately need a state commission of inquiry. It is existential for the survival of Israel, because if we don't learn the lessons of what went wrong on October 7th and what led to October 7th, I will sign now. It will happen again. And it might not happen at this scale or this scope, but we will be surprised again in the future, because there will come a time when quiet will again prevail, hopefully, and will return, and we will fall back in love with that quiet. And then the next time we see Hamas moving a rocket, or Hezbollah digging a tunnel, or Iran sending a shipment of weapons into Lebanon, whatever it might be, we'll say, you know what? School year is about to begin. It's the Jewish holiday season in 2 weeks. We don't want to rock the boat. We want to keep things quiet. Let's just jot down on our notebook. We'll add it to the target bank, and one day, we'll deal with it. And then from one rocket, you get to 10, and you get to 100, and you get to 1,000, 10,000, and 100,000. And that's what happened with Hezbollah. I mean, I think Hezbollah is the best example of how not to run things, because we had a clash with him. You all remember in the summer of 2006, 34 days. And I mean, I covered that war. I was the Jerusalem Post military reporter at the time. And, it was a tough war. It was seen as a war that we did not win in the beginning. And quiet did come, and we celebrated the quiet, because we said Hezbollah now is deterred. But what was Hezbollah actually doing? They were going from an organization with maybe about 20, 25,000 fighters and maybe 20, 25,000 rockets, to an organization that when they opened fire on Israel on October 8th, the day after October 7th, they had 150,000 rockets and missiles that now covered the entire state of Israel. They had 60, 70,000 fighters. They had themselves tunnels along the border with Israel, which we discovered in 2018 and destroyed. But I mean, all the signs were there. But what was happening? We were scared of Hezbollah. We were afraid to take on Hezbollah, because that buildup creates deterrence also the other way. We can't go back to that. So the State Commission of Inquiry is so desperately needed, because we have to make sure that we institute and we learn the lessons, and we institute the structural changes that are required so that this will not happen again. And to your point, Jonathan, Netanyahu will never allow it. And it won't allow it for two. I mean, listen, I don't know everything. I can't predict everything, but I can pretty much assume he won't, for two reasons. One, he knows he's culpable to a large extent. And number two, he's never established a commission of inquiry in all of his years as Israel's prime minister. 3 years in the 90s, pretty much now for the last 16 years, minus the 18 months of Bennett Lapid. He has never established a commission of inquiry. I think he's the only prime minister, maybe one other, who in their terms in office did not establish a state commission of inquiry. There was the famous and tragic disaster at a mountain called Meron back in, I think it was 2020, when tens of thousands of people descend on, it's a holy pilgrimage on a holiday called Lag BaOmer, shortly after Passover. And they light bonfires, whatever. Won't get into the Jewish rituals there. But there were tens of thousands of people. There was a stampede. 40 young men were killed. And nothing. The guy who was the police minister at the time gets promoted to be the speaker of the Knesset. The police commissioner, this wasn't military, it was civil. The police commissioner stays in his job. The fire chief stays in his job. And Netanyahu stays in his job. Now, I don't think we got to become like, I don't know, Korea or Japan, where like a train accident where two people get killed, the whole government resigns, right? I don't know we need to go that far, but we need a culture of accountability. We don't have that today in Israel. So this is not to replace the State Commission of Inquiry, but we need to move in that direction. I mean, and just on the recommendations, I mean, just three very quick ones, because we try to give a few. One is there needs to be structural reform to our intelligence agencies. I'll just give you one quick example. The IDF, military intelligence, sits under the IDF and is within the IDF and is under the Defense Ministry, so under the purview of the Minister of Defense. The Shin Bet and the Mossad are under the direct authority of the Prime Minister. And there have been too many cases over the years of, like, imagine Lieberman, a different defense minister from a different party, Netanyahu, prime minister from a different party. So when these guys want to go to, like, if Lieberman says, I want to invite the Shin Bet chief or the Mossad chief to a briefing in my office, that guy needs sign off from the prime minister. Now, it's usually always given, and it's usually given as a carte blanche. But sometimes if there's political tension between the prime minister and the defense minister, they start to play games with these things. We can't have that. I mean, that's nonsense. That's noise. We need more human intelligence assets. How is it that 3,000 people crossed into Israel on October 7th? Now, not all of them were Hamas Nukhba fighters, but out of the hundreds that were, we didn't have one guy who could pick up a phone and say, hey, we're coming. Not one. And we had none. We had no human informants in Gaza, pretty much. I mean, how do we get to that point? Mm-hmm. So we really have to restructure and rechange. A lot of that has been going on to the credit of the IDF and the Shin Bet over the last 2 years. We need to, I'll tell you something, here in the United States, we have to work and focus on the alliance with this country. You all, I'm sure, heard Jake Sullivan make his comment the other day about how he's recommending to senators in the Senate, the Democratic members, to vote and to support a freeze on weapons shipments to Israel. I mean, that could come in a future administration. We need to open up new bridges and lines and re-establish the alliance that we have with this country, where Israel used to be a bipartisan issue. Mm-hmm. And today, not only is it partisan, I think we're even losing the one party that might even still, you have a majority of people who support you in the Republican Party. You have, so you have all that. We have public diplomacy recommendations, but I think that also and with this, I'll just end. I personally did not realize this part of the story of how much unity of a people is integral for national security. And that became clear to me when October 7th happened. And remember where we were. We were fighting about judicial reform. We were on the streets every single day. We were at each other's throats. And some of it was important. I support some of what they wanted to do in judicial reform. I think we need more transparency of how we select our Supreme Court justices. I mean, there's a lot to do, but we distracted ourselves, we exposed ourselves, we made ourselves vulnerable, and our enemies took advantage of it. And to go back to that now is just setting ourselves up for something like this to happen. So unity is a nice phrase and it makes you feel warm and fuzzy, but it actually has serious national security implications.
Thank you. I'll open it up to the audience, and I see we already have a few questions. So sorry, or you had your hand up first. So please introduce yourself if you don't.
Ori Soltis, I teach in the CJC. The course I teach is on the Middle East. It's sort of a twofold question, Yaakov. Brilliant analysis. Connect for me the decision to ignore all of the signs on the part of the upper echelon to what happened, of course, in October of 1973, where arrogance and our sense that the Egyptians can't put anything together went against the information that was coming regarding what was coming. Was that part of it? And this leads to my second question, it's a more fundamental one. Does Bibi give a damn about the state of Israel, or does he only care about his career? Because the timing was, as you just pointed out, rather interesting. In the midst of what was going on with all those protests against his desired reforms, which seemed very much reforms he desired in his own interest, and everything that followed October 7th, his failure to take responsibility, to show, if he shows no empathy for the Palestinians, he seemed to show no empathy for the hostages or for the Israelis. Does he care about Israel or just about his political power, like someone else I am familiar with on this side of the Atlantic, who's in charge of a country about which he clearly doesn't care?
So, to question,
an extreme.
Thanks, Ori. Thank you.
It's all good. It's all good. To question number one, the hubris and arrogance that led to October 6th, 1973, the attack then. I wrote a piece on the eve of Yom Kippur in 2023. In the Jerusalem Post, where I said, it's the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. I didn't have any insight. I didn't know, for example, that people in military intelligence had been sending letters to the prime minister warning that what's happening on the streets is weakening us in the eyes of our enemies. We didn't know at that point all these different, we knew that Gallant, who had been the defense minister, had given that speech and warned, and then Netanyahu fired him, and then there were the outbreak of protests, and then he retracted the firing. So there were those voices, but they weren't taken too seriously. But there was there was a lot more. But you just need common sense. We were on the eve of the greatest disaster that had befallen Israel military in 50 years ago. And I asked a simple question. I mean, we saw what we're now marking 50 years. We saw what happened then. We're ripping ourselves apart here. If we saw these protests on the streets of Tehran or Damascus or Beirut, would we not fan the flames, also a little, kind of achieve the goals that we want in those places? So why wouldn't our enemies try to do the same? And they did, right? Part of it came from in the failure to read and see all that happening. I think was there were some. I mean, listen, the chief of staff tried to meet famously with the prime minister when they were voting on one of those days, and the prime minister refused to meet with him. And not that he didn't know about Hamas's attack, but again, that general sense. But why did they miss the intelligence? Why didn't they see it that way? I think that the real debate on the night between October 6th and 7th was this a drill or is this an attack? And if it is an attack, what kind of attack? And at the most, they figured that they would infiltrate maybe at 2 different points if it was going to be an attack. And remember, we were impenetrable. We had the most sophisticated border defense. We had Iron Dome. We had the Iron Wall. And we had troops along the border. So even if they try something, we're there. And if they come in, maybe it'll be at 2 spots. You know how many spots they came in through on the border? It was about 65, 70 almost, eventually. I mean, we just completely misread the whole thing. So part of that was that arrogance that they can't touch us, but they could. To your second point, look, I in the book, we don't get too much into the personal particulars of Netanyahu.
You explained that. That's just.
But I have for probably the larger part of the last, 10 years or so, written weekly, very critically of him, and called for his resignation already several years ago, way before this. I have many issues with him as a prime minister. I think he has divided our country, and he's one of the most divisive politicians for the purpose of political survival, to polarize, to divide. Netanyahu always needs an adversary, somebody who can say, you need me to protect you from him. Once it was Hamas, then it became Barack Obama, then it became Iran. Now it's the left, it's the media, it's the similar things that you got going on here, right? I'm not sure. People like to think it's Bibi learning from Trump. I think Trump is learning to some extent also from Bibi. And I think that he should be held accountable. It was his policies. He set these policies. However, I can't be intellectually honest. It's not a zero-sum game. Netanyahu is responsible for what led to October 7th. He'll tell you they didn't wake me up in the middle of the night. Would he have made a decision that would have changed things anything? Probably not, but we don't know. But what we do know is that October 7th is a coin with 2 sides. One side is the utter failure, and that's what this book mostly is about. But the other side is the re-engineering of the Middle East that has taken place since then. Hezbollah beaten back. Iran beaten. Hamas degraded. Controversial how that war is being prosecuted and what comes next. But Hamas, a shadow of what it once was. The Houthis, still capable of firing rockets, but they've been hit hard. And Assad, it wasn't us who toppled him, but it was the result of what Israel had done in the region. So you look at the region now, and there's no doubt in my mind Israel is more safe and secure than it was on October 6th or October 7th. Now, diplomatically, we could talk about what that means, but from a military perspective, we are safer today. And that is Netanyahu as well. So he deserves the blame, but he also deserves the credit to some extent. So it's not always, in Hebrew we say, it's not always a chadefes. It's not always 1 or 0. It can be a mixed bag. That doesn't take away from his culpability and responsibility. And I think that that's important also for the culture of accountability that I want to see in my country.
Sorry, Chuck, you had your second up.
First of all, thanks for everybody talk, and I very much look forward to reading the book. I'd ask you to go back now to the various major decision points before October 2nd. The different rounds with Hamas, with Hezbollah. What's the containment? And there was the systemic failure was colossal on October 2nd. But was the containment policy mistaken? Would you have made different decisions at each of those points, given what you knew at the time?
No, no, I would not have. And I supported it. And I wrote in favor of it. And I think many people did. There were people who were against it. There were people who were warning about the money from Qatar. There were people who were warning about disengagement. I mean, I look back, people say to me all the time, so disengagement was a mistake? My answer is no. It was not a mistake. We should not have kept 12,000 Jews in a sea of 2 million Palestinians. It didn't make sense then. I was on the ground for 2 weeks in Gaza during disengagement. It was heartbreaking to see people ripped from their homes, right? But I think we made the right decision. But, yes, looking back now, should we have done it in a vacuum, unilaterally, without taking steps? Of course not. When Hamas is shortly after elected in the January 2006 elections, and then in the summer of 2007 violently takes over Gaza, should we have maybe changed? I mean, there were all these things along the way, but it seemed right because, at least from my perspective, as someone who's pretty much my whole career been writing about military, we had Iran, we had Hezbollah, and Hamas. Yeah, it was a whack-a-mole game occasionally. I don't want to make it sound childish, but that's what it was. They would do something to us, we'd hit them on the head, we'd have a 2-week thing, a 3-week thing, a 2-day thing, a 3-day thing, whatever it was. And of course, there are casualties and it's all terrible. But it's kind of like, listen, Naftali Bennett said something which was never appropriate, but it wasn't wrong from the reality of how Israel was living. He compared the Palestinian conflict to a piece of shrapnel that's in a friend of his rear end. Grenade had exploded and the piece of shrapnel got stuck. And he said, depending on the weather, sometimes it hurts and sometimes it doesn't. He said, that's how we should look at the Palestinians. Sometimes we got to deal with it, but sometimes we don't. And that's kind of what happened to Gaza. It was there. We knew it was there. We knew Hamas was there, but we said, listen, there's other levers that we could do. And for the most part, we all supported it because it seemed like the right thing. So again, it's very easy now to go and write a book and say, look, we should have this and we should have that. And that's why I write it and I say it. I feel a measure of responsibility too, because I feel as somebody who was in those meetings. I mean, I was in a briefing with the chief of staff of the IDF several months before October 7th. It was about 3 hours long. And they went through all the different fronts. Iran, we spent a lot of time on. Hezbollah, a ton of time on. The West Bank, a ton of time on. Weapons development, a ton of time on. It wasn't just me, it was a bunch of journalists. And Gaza was like at the end, it was kind of, Sinwar's deterred, he doesn't want war, we're doing the economic stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And everyone's like, okay. And I look back now and I say, I mean, we saw what was happening in Gaza, right? I mean, we saw the protests on the border. We heard Sinwar's speeches. We knew there was no political horizon at all. Because there wasn't, because Israel decided to a large extent, not that we necessarily have a partner, and that's a whole other conversation, but we were not engaging in a political horizon. You and I have spoken a lot about this. I think that in my small little role, maybe I could have asked some tougher questions and gotten them to push them to think of better answers. And maybe that would have gotten some spark, some kind of, of course, it wouldn't have changed them. But I think we were all part of this mindset in Israel. And therefore, it's easy now, but I agreed with it completely at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, please. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Clark Brammer. I'm a senior here studying at Georgetown International Politics. I thought what you said about unity was really interesting, how unity is a national security interest. But how do you prescribe unity to a democracy? Like, what is security vulnerability just a byproduct of any democratic governance, or is there something specifically that we can do to prevent such vulnerability in the future?
It's a very good question. I don't know that I have necessarily the right answer, but what I can tell you is, look, you have major political polarization here. I mean, the tragedy yesterday, of course, with the shooting and murder of Charlie Kirk, and let's wait to see, obviously, what it was and who was it. But I mean, there is political division in this country that, and I was born and raised here. I've never seen it in my lifetime, and I'm sure many of you either. With that said, I don't think you face the threats on your borders like we do. So while you can have division here, is that no one's looking to invade you tomorrow. right?
Yeah.
I mean, we literally have people who are sitting on our border who want our destruction and call for it every single day, right? So when you are divided as a people and you are distracted and you are not focused, you are taking your eye off the ball, and that is to ensure the survival of the Jewish people or the Jewish state. It's that simple, right? There, I would say it is a zero-sum game. And therefore, for Israel, this type of division is something that quickly, and again, I did not see it up until October 7th, right? And that was, maybe it was obvious to others. It was not, it was not obvious to me. It quickly translates into an exposure and a vulnerability and a weakness that our enemies take advantage of. What I would want to see are politicians who care, and you know, maybe I skipped over that second part of your question, so this ties back into it. Now I'm remembering. Is Netanyahu just solely focused on his political survival? I don't think so. I don't think it's that simple. I think that Netanyahu is, like many politicians, that is a definite big percentage of his considerations. But I think that Netanyahu also has changed. I think that in Netanyahu's mind today, he views his continued political survival as existential for the state of Israel. So he believes that if he's not here, Israel might not survive. Now, that's a hubris and arrogance of a whole other level.
Protection.
Right, very pretentious. But I also think is that he's not, he believes that he has done good by the hostages to some extent. He's brought back, and I was just speaking yesterday with his hostage envoy, Gal Hirsch, that he's brought back, what is it now, 200 of the hostages or so, pretty much, 203. And, you know, not all of them alive, obviously, the majority of alive, 150 or 160, if whatever the number is. There's still 48 in Gaza. But, you know, he says, okay, I mean, we brought back almost the vast majority. We're still fighting the war. I mean, what more do people want from me to some extent? And of course, there's a million answers to it. But I think it's part of that. But I think I would want to see politicians who put themselves, their interests aside and put the country first. And there's so many ways for that to happen. I mean, this isn't the topic here, but just one thing to say, the draft law in Israel, right? Look at what's going on today in Israel. You have a minority today of the country that is carrying the national burden. People who have served hundreds of days in the reserves. People have lost jobs. I have countless friends who have lost their jobs, lost their businesses. My own brother, my youngest brother, mid-30s, gets called up on October 7th as a reservist, serves in an elite infantry unit, goes up to the border, spends 100 days on the border in the north, comes under rocket fire, clashes with Hezbollah. He towards the end of about 100 days, suddenly gets sick. Turns out he has diabetes, right? I mean, I didn't know that diabetes is something that comes on by stress and is stress-induced. Turns out you have dozens of reservists now who in their mid-30s suddenly have diabetes, right? Now, that's not I mean, it could be life-threatening, but it's a manageable illness. This is just one example that's happening all over. How many people? I have a good friend who I just spent this past Shabbat with, mid-20s, who lost his leg in the war, right? And is here now in Washington, in the Washington area, getting a new prosthetic here in the United States, because the one that he was given in Israel just isn't. He's gone already through 5 different surgeries, happened almost 2 years ago, and still rehabilitating and recuperating. They're broken, and they're being asked to do more while we have a sector in society that doesn't serve a single day. Now, we know that there's 60,000, 70,000 young, capable men who can serve. We don't have enough soldiers. How are we not drafting them? Politics. So it's time to put that aside and do what's right for the country. So that's part of unity as well.
And just the last one, Rabbi, please. Thank you.
So thank you for being here. Following up on the question of unity, how do you imagine kind of the country striving for unity while also really having those difficult internal conversations that would allow for real accountability to happen? And I don't know if this is what you're saying, but sometimes calls for unity try to just gloss over real internal debates that have to happen. And what if Israel was to skip that part of this process of getting back to what it needs to be for that sake of?
You're 100% right. Again, that's why I said unity can't just be this warm and fuzzy word, you know, that we feel good about, right? Achdut ba'am, unity among the people. That's not enough. What we need are the real deep substantive changes within Israeli political system and society that can create an equality within our country. For example, on the military service. I mean, I have again, I'll just talk about my personal circuit. And again, I'm no different than anyone else, right? But I have my wife is one of 5 kids. She has a brother who is ultra-Orthodox, who has kids the same age as my daughter, and her other brother has triplet sons. All 3 were in Gaza at the same time fighting. One in a unit called Egos, one in a unit called Sayeret Golani, one in a unit called Sayeret Tzanaim. All 3 elite units, right? All in Gaza. My sister-in-law till today. One just got out, 2 are still fighting. She is a broken woman. I mean, I don't know how she's gotten through the last. These are triplet kids that they waited 10 years to have, right? The other brother has kids around the same age. And I have a daughter who just finished 3 years of military service as an officer in the IDF. I drove her back to base on October 7th, right? Because she was called up from home because it was a holiday, it was Shabbat. And we have another brother. My wife has another brother whose kids don't serve. What are they doing? I don't even know. Now imagine those Shabbat meals when we get together today, right? What that does to this family. It's they don't happen that often anymore. And I love my brother-in-law. I think he's completely confused and mistaken. And I mean, the 2 brothers aren't really talking that much anymore. So I mean, like, this is something that really is in every home today, right? And has to be dealt with. I'll tell you one other thing, and I don't want to go on too long because I know we got to finish, but like, I look at the Israeli Arab community in Israel, right? You remember just very briefly, 2021, we had the Operation Guardian of the Walls, Shomer Chomot it was called. Hamas fires rockets in Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day, Operation in Gaza again, and riots break out in all the mixed cities. Lod, Haifa, Akko, and there's lynching by Arabs of Jews and Jews of Arabs. Terrible. And so after that operation, the IDF gets together and they say, we got to create a force that's going to keep open the highways in Israel. There's this one highway, it's kind of like the cross-country highway called Kvish 6. Right, we got to keep it open. And it goes from the south, from the north, all the way down to the south. Because in a future war, when we're going to send reinforcements and supplies and weapons and troops, the Arabs are going to come out in the middle of the country, what's known as the Triangle, Al-Fathim and these other, and they're going to block the roads. So they created this unit of reservists who are going to be there, and they're going to keep the roads open with force. We've been fighting in Gaza now for what, 2 years almost? How many riots have broken out in mixed cities? 0. So if you're a responsible government, what do you say to yourself? Wow, there's a unique opportunity today to take this 2.2 or whatever it is million Israeli Arabs who are Israeli citizens just like I am, and integrate them better into Israeli society, make them feel more equal, right? Why are we not doing that? Why are we not taking advantage of this opportunity? This is a huge opportunity for Israel. So we're facing, the way I kind of look at it, we have so many, this war has exposed problems, but has also created opportunity. And it would be such a miss and such a failure if we don't fix the flaws, but also take advantage of the opportunities internally and externally. Syria, Lebanon, there are, in Gaza too, in the future of our conflict with the Palestinians. We can change reality today. We have to seize these moments.
Yaakov, thank you so much. First, we have books for students available in the back, and Yaakov said he will stay and sign some if you're interested. So students who are here, I know a lot left for class already, unfortunately, but we'll also put it, announce it on our social media so people can come pick it up at the CJC. We also have, please look at our website. We have a number of events. I won't go into all of them. But a couple scheduled already for next week on the 60th anniversary of Vatican II, for example, together with the Berkeley Center. Also a discussion with Deborah Shushan, former policy advisor at J Street on Jewish American politics since October 7th. And we have a number of other academic events and planned for this semester. Please join me in thanking Yaakov